Welcome to the Elevator Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Madden. I've had an amazing 35 years in the elevator industry, and now I'm ready to pay my knowledge forward. Let's dive right in. Welcome to the Elevator Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm excited to have Jim Fox here with ATIS. Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history, your background, how you got into the elevator industry, and what led you to where you are today?
No, absolutely. First, Sean, thanks for having me on. I love watching your podcast. I am new to the elevator industry, as you'll hear here in a second. So it's great to listen and hear the different perspectives of your guest and learn a lot about the history of the elevator industry and where people, see it going. And so it's a great watch for me. So thanks for doing this. So Jim Fox, CEO of ATIS, been with the company about 15 months, and that's the duration of me in the elevator industry.
Nice.
So I'm a newbie. You often hear stories of people with 30, 40, 50 years of experience. I have 15 months. And so just as a reminder, ATIS is one of the largest elevator inspection, consulting, and managed service providers in North America. And so how I got here, maybe start with my professional journey. Over the last few decades, I've been in online education, data centers, cable media, information and professional services. So really set me up well to know the elevator industry. But in that time, I worked for companies from 5 million to 5 billion. And kind of what led me to this is there are some similar dynamics that were going on in those industries when I joined them as there are in the elevator industry today. And I'll get into those, I'm sure, over the time. But my background in my early stage of my career, I was in operations and finance for companies like Deloitte, where I started. I spent about a decade at Deloitte, a professional service consulting type company, Reuters, a news and information business, and Suddenlink Communications. And then later in my half of my career, I've spent a lot more time in strategy and growth. Nice. And that was emerging in high growth companies. So I guess maybe the thing that's common between my background and career and the elevator industry is, as I mentioned, those were kind of highly fragmented industries, maybe some things going on in service challenges at that point, at a crossroads of technology change and now AI change. So there's a lot of consolidation going on. There was a lot of service challenges. And so when a friend of mine and a past colleague called me and said, "Hey, would you consider this role as CEO of ATIS in the elevator industry?" I at first was like, not sure I know much about the elevator industry. And he started describing what was going on in the industry and their perspective on it. There was just a lot of pattern recognition. The industry is going through a lot of change that I mentioned. And so there's a tremendous opportunity to bring through ATIS to help the industry get better service quality, better safety, more compliance.
Yeah.
Do that through technology and data enablement. And so it's really exciting to bring a different perspective into the elevator space.
No, it's actually pretty amazing because we do have a lot of people that's been in this industry a long time, and we're probably a little set in our ways, maybe, It's worked for a long time, but I always find it intriguing to bring in outside perspectives. Somebody that came from a totally different industry or potentially similar industry, but saw things differently. And you're right, our industry is changing dynamically with technology very aggressively. And obviously AI is going to change a lot of that even more. But we are typically 10, 15 years behind technology, but I don't think that's going to be the case with as fast as this stuff's coming. I think it's going to come a lot faster than we've seen in the past.
I totally agree. And not just, AI will be an enabler. It'll make some complex problems simpler to solve or accelerate the speed of those. But I just think the technology enablement and the data enablement piece of this, and really honestly, I just think the service quality demands it. Yeah. Right now is that transparency in data. And ultimately, if you think about it, like this is about rider safety and compliance. I often remind myself about the air traffic controllers at airports or CPAs in the finance industry. That's our role as inspectors and consultant managed services sometimes, is to be that standard of independent service delivery and quality and ensure that our clients, building owners, operators are getting that level of service that ensures rider safety and operating performance. And so we feel this sort of responsibility to the industry, this obligation to the industry to ensure that. And so it's an interesting industry. And when you're not meeting those needs, the demand for change goes faster.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting you said that because when I owned my elevator business, Madden Elevator Company, one of the things I always told people is, you got to stop and think. We have people's lives in our hands every single day. Everything we do, we have people's lives in our hands, and we move more people, more miles than any other form of transportation. And when I say that, a lot of people are like, whoa, I didn't even think about it that way. I thought I was just working on elevators. Well, no, you got to slow down and realize how important is what we do. And I think that's happened a little bit in the past where some of the industry just everybody kind of gets into this rhythm of just doing the normal stuff. But when you stop and think about it that way, and I actually joined the Elevator Escalator Safety Foundation board for that purpose to try to educate people how to safely ride elevators better and escalators because there's a lot of changing in technology and a lot of times people don't know there's things that can go wrong. And so paying attention to if the car's level or not having kids stick their arm in doors or obviously escalators have a lot of safety opportunities to train kids not to play on escalators. But those are the things that excite me about being on the board of the Elevator Escalator Safety Foundation and trying to help drive that mission home to the kids in the schools. So it's an exciting piece.
But that's awesome. I mean, when I came in, it was one of the things, I talked with our team about, like, we're refreshing our mission and our purpose, and we were crafting words, and we've had it for a long time. And we actually ended up changing a word to it's our obligation, our responsibility to ensure safety and compliance
I
and
like that.
performance. Right. And so we really take that seriously and we try to live up to it every day. And part of our job, I think, is to help because our clients, building operators, universities, retail, they're very close to their constituents and their riders, and
Right.
they feel that responsibility. And the further you get from that critical point, the harder it is to remember that's what it's all about.
Right.
And so our job, I think, is to help hopefully get service providers and others to naturally understand that and comply with those service requirements. But if not, hold them accountable to it and do that on behalf of our clients because they need the support and help to make sure that the ecosystem works.
That's great. I love that word obligation. It actually changes your mindset slightly in terms of, we do this, we do that, but obligation, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Now it just changes the framework slightly. So that's awesome.
Yeah,
Great
I
to
think the
hear.
obligation and responsibility, like the obligation being the responsibility to our clients, like those two things, I try to speak as often as I can about it with our teams.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. So, Jim, since you haven't been in the industry long, you probably haven't had a lot of hiccups that you could talk about, like experiences or something that you dealt with in business that was a challenge that you had to overcome. What is something you see on the horizon that you see that is going to be a challenge for our industry or a challenge for businesses and business owners? Is there something out there that you're seeing that could be a big challenge? And what are some ideas on what we might be able to do to navigate those things?
Yeah, I think these are informed theories,
Hmm.
probably, and love your feedback on it. But ultimately, if you step back and you go, there is a shortage of elevator talent and expertise at our clients, at building owners, and this is often the most expensive asset in their building.
Right.
As you pointed out, has a huge safety and compliance responsibility there for COVID and natural retirement ages. There are less and less elevator experts at operators of businesses and building owners, and so that gap with kind of the service quality that's been plaguing the industry for a period of time for a
Hmm.
variety of different reasons, aging technology, aging workforce, and challenges just to deliver. This is actually creating a unhealthy friction in the industry. And
Hmm.
and ultimately, if you bring it back to this obligation we talked about earlier, you have to create a healthy environment for client, for operator, and service provider to work to ensure that safety and
Yeah.
compliance and performance. And so that challenge, that gap, is really the opportunity not only for companies like ATIS, but it's an opportunity for the service providers to raise their bar. Spent much of this last year talking to our clients and the leaders of service providers and manufacturers, and they all acknowledge kind of this unhealthy friction because we measure things differently. We don't have the same data. There's not a clear standard of service excellence across organizations or across footprints. And so there's a tremendous need to create a healthy win-win-win
Yeah.
environment where safety and compliance happens, performance happens, and ultimately, everybody's got to find a way to make a little bit of money in the process, or the
Right.
ecosystem sort of breaks.
Yeah, for
And,
sure.
so that's the challenge I see, and that problem seems to be getting bigger. But
Yeah.
the opportunity of data and communication and contract alignment really is there to create a more healthy working environment.
There is definitely a big gap. And, it's a big topic. We've talked about this many times in many forums. The old school days are where you go service an elevator and you follow the checklist and you go through the process to check everything top to bottom all the way through is ultimately the best way to do it, right? But the challenge has become the cost of mechanics, the cost of time, getting in and out of buildings, change in building management, and finding the right people to help support that. But ultimately, what happens, or what I've seen happen, is the end user rider is the one that's suffering, right? Because there are things that are getting missed, and either the elevator's breaking, or there's more entrapments, or there's more potential challenging safety compliant issues. And there's a lot of talk around that about doing safety tests and making sure they're done properly. I've always been a big advocate of checklists, and I've always been a big advocate of using technology. So at my company, we actually was one of the first adopters of a lot of the elevator monitoring systems. Didn't really know exactly how we're going to use it. We tried a plethora of things. We failed on a lot of things, and we were successful on a lot of things. And one of the things we learned that I thought was very intriguing was how much elevators actually run, because the monitor will do a lot in terms of tell you a lot of info, but too much info is like, what do you do with it, right? And so we had these parking garages and they had bets on what elevator was going to run the most in a month, right? So it was a little bit of fun trying to understand that piece. But the other piece was, oh, okay, if this elevator runs a lot more, it's going to need more service. If this elevator runs less, then we may not need to take as much time on specific things. So, what we started doing to utilize the technology to find ways to augment our service, we weren't trying to take away, we were trying to figure out how to work smarter. Is we would take the information and say, all right, what doors had a certain amount of cycles that needed to spend some time on that door, because maybe the elevator doesn't run to the 15th floor 100,000 times, but it does to the third floor for whatever reason. And so we were using the data to try to augment how we pinpoint and focus our service in the right areas. And we wasn't perfect at it, but we got better and better on using the information to help support that. But that's where I see technology really helping and finding ways to use it in an effective way to augment. And unfortunately, elevator monitoring has got a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, because a lot of the major companies put them on their elevators and just quit going. They just don't show up. They don't show up unless there's a problem. And if they do show up, they only go, like, I have a guy that worked for one of the majors, and he was supposed to go do service, and he was to go to the machine room and do a certain amount of thing and never go to the car. It's like, that's crazy to me. Like, that just doesn't make sense. At a very minimum, I always taught the guys, or girls, you got to show up, you got to talk to the customer, you got to go ride the car, and you look, listen, and feel. And use your knowledge of the industry, look, listen, and feel, see what's going on. Go to the machine room, look, listen, feel, see what's going on, and then go into the specific focus areas that you need to make sure, life safety compliances. Always check phones, always check fire alarms or fire service, always check emergency lighting, some of that basic stuff that often gets overlooked, because if something happens, you want to make sure that customer is as safe as they can be. Door lock restrictors oftentimes get overlooked. So those are the things that I use technology to help with, and I think we're going to have to find ways in our industry to use that technology because the lack of talent. We're going to have to do things smarter, better, faster, but we can use the technology to help do that in a more augmented way instead of taking away. And that's my opinion about it. What's your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. I think we know a lot of the time today that unhealthy dialogue about the performance of the elevator with lack of transparency and lack of data leads to a lack of trust in communication and standards.
Mhm.
And so people assume the worst. And sometimes it's not the worst, and sometimes it is, right? And so if we can bring transparency to that, we can bring clarity to the data. And then, most of the time, we want to do a good job and keep people safe.
Right.
Some of the time they're not, and you have to have some ground rules and accountability around
Right.
that. And so I think that's what we see our job as an extension of our clients, our building owners, to help them be their trusted advisor,
Yeah.
to look at the data, to look at the KPIs, to understand the service quality, maybe to tweak a contract so that, to your point, one that is out in the cold in the middle of Minnesota in a parking garage and gets a lot of use has got a different profile
Right.
than obviously one in the middle of Topeka, Kansas at a retail store that just has a two stop and doesn't get used very much, right? And
Right.
and so how do you ensure safety, compliance, and consistency across those ultimately is a responsibility. It's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, one of the largest providers of consulting managed services in North America. And in Canada, we've been operating under the brand KJA for, you know, 60 years.
Yeah.
Over the last 15, 20 years, they've been delivering high quality managed services and consulting. And the way they've got to a more healthy, higher quality service in a colder, more difficult environment at times is that data transparency.
Yeah.
Canada adopted that approach earlier, and I think there's a real opportunity to bring some of that transparency, alignment between service provider, client, operator to the U.S. market.
Yeah.
And obviously, given our geographic spread and the number of buildings, that's a much bigger opportunity and need and more difficult to accomplish. But it's definitely a viable option that we've found work other markets, and we're obviously been doing here for a few years now. And you can see a healthier dialogue when that data is consistent, when
Yeah.
the meetings are happening on a consistent basis. I recently met with the CEO of a service provider. I won't say who it is, but they consistently get higher marks than every other service provider we hear about that we review.
Hmm.
And I was talking to him and I said, "Why are you better?
Right.
Why do our clients like you better?" And he said, to your point earlier, we fill out a contract in partnership with you guys or with our clients, and then we do the work that we said we were going to do. And
Right.
oh, that's pretty novel.
That's
And then I
interesting.
said, and then we're transparent about sharing it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not that easy, but it
Yeah.
should be easier than it is. And I think that's really where we see our opportunity is to help the industry,
Yeah.
um, especially on behalf of our clients, be that trusted partner for reading the data,
Right.
creating the data. And to your point, technology and AI will allow us to consume and think about the symptoms and the problems of that data
Right.
faster, better, smarter, so
Yeah.
that the hours we spend can be most beneficial to safety, compliance, and performance.
The one thing that comes to mind, and you probably deal with this all the time, is oftentimes elevator companies don't want consultants involved. They don't want that third party involved. I always welcomed it because I was like, great, I have an advocate that's going to help me explain to the customer what I might not be able to explain to them in the best way. And they're an outside party. So it helps that relationship. And for the most part, I think consultant companies, support companies like ATIS is there to help that transition of information. And I was always open with information, like tell me if I'm doing something wrong so I can go fix it. Right. I want to do a good job. I want to make sure we're doing a good job for the client. Yeah, we're not perfect. Yeah, we're going to make mistakes. But if we all work together on figuring out how to solve those things, then it's a win-win-win, a win for the consultant, a win for the customer, and a win for the elevator company. So I always really enjoyed having a consultant involved, as long as, and they typically have always been, hey, let's talk through how we can make this a good beneficial thing instead of it being like button heads. And that's what you don't want. You don't want somebody coming in and pointing fingers, because that doesn't help anybody. And that's where I think some of the elevator companies are worried. Oh, they're going to come in and tell me I'm doing my job wrong. No, they're going to come in and potentially help you. And that's what I try to tell people. They could potentially help you educate the customer on things the customer may need. Maybe they need a mod, or maybe they need a door upgrade, or maybe they need something that you've been trying to explain, and they just think you're trying to sell them something, and they can be your advocate to help with that. Have you dealt with some of that stuff?
Absolutely. I think the best relationships are that we think about our clients and operators and owners of buildings, like they're trying to make sure the building has uptime. They have 1,000 things to do. They have to be good at fire safety. They have to make sure the cleaning company shows up. They have to renew leases. Like those words don't involve, door locks
Right.
and braking systems, right? And so, we can be the translator for that and we can help. And that same service provider I talked to you about before, he said the same thing you did. He said, I always kind of wait when the consultant's involved or the managed service company is involved, and it makes me pause. But every time we're doing it, we have a better conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, do they worry? Yes, but is it more healthy? I believe so.
Yeah.
And part of that is back to where we started. What are the challenges in the industry?
Yeah.
Because there is a shortage of expert talent, not only on these new elevators that are coming out that are a little bit more parts interchangeable, as
Mm-hmm.
well as old elevators that are working super. And now you have to figure out how to keep parts available to keep them up and running. It's a lot. It's a lot for a building operator and a client to just be able to manage. And the
Yeah.
service provider is trying to take care of their thing. And sometimes their thing they're taking care of isn't even their thing. It's their competitors
Right.
that they're now being asked to manage. And so
Exactly.
it's a really complex environment. And to think that service provider or client can make that fit perfectly all the time is difficult. And the more devices, buildings you have, the more challenging that is to do.
100%. That's a really big topic. Good stuff. Good conversation. We could probably go on for hours, actually. One thing that came to mind, I was thinking about, you know, the service side of it, and service companies have been trying to figure out, okay, how do I do monitoring? What do I do with it? How do I make it work? But you said something earlier that I thought was interesting. The consultant may be able to take some of that on and let them manage the data and let them figure out what the data is saying, and then partner and work with the company and the client to see what is the right type of service. Maybe it needs more service because it runs more. Maybe it needs less service because it doesn't really run a lot. Put the resources towards the right place that's going to really help the end user. That's ultimately the goal. And it's no longer come in and service every hydro for an hour, because that just doesn't make sense, right? It's kind of like a car. You don't necessarily need to change the oil every 3,000 miles anymore. They're actually getting smarter, and they're telling you when to change it based on your driving habits. And it's a
That's right.
similar scenario. So I think that is a really important tweak that could help the shortage in labor, and the give people more time to actually work on troubleshooting the problems when that happens, and less time, I'll call it, doing basic PM that may not necessarily be as important for that particular elevator, because it might be more important to spend more time in a different area.
Yeah, there's a lot of analogies, whether it's in cybersecurity today, like where are your risk points in the system and how do you put your energy and time to it? It's going to take a little bit of time to transition through that because the way that maintenance agreements are written,
Yeah.
the way that contracts are written,
Right.
but ultimately getting clear alignment between the operators and owners and the service providers is part of our opportunity challenge and a gap in the space today.
Yeah,
And we're
100%.
excited about helping broker that
That's
a better
definitely
future.
key for sure. Well, Jim, what's a golden nugget you want to leave our listeners with today? What's one thing that you want them to take away?
I think as I reflect on what our clients have said to me, what service providers said to me, is really if you're an entrepreneur like you were in your business or you've been established, you know, the the service provider that everybody loved is transparent, shows up on time and does it. And I think if you start with um, a belief that if you do the right thing, you deliver the high quality service, you embrace the safety and compliance that your clients feel the obligation of, you're going to build trust, and trust is going to lead to a relationship that is a virtuous cycle for both service and growth. And that's where we put it. At the end of the day, we have core values of, teamwork, integrity, and service. And that is what we talk about. And agility for us is about having a can-do, willing to solve attitude. Teamwork, obviously, is working with our clients and the vendors to create a healthy system. Integrity is like, hey, you got to show up every day, and when no one's looking, you got to do a great inspection of that elevator. And service comes back to when you do all those things right, service becomes the outcome. And so I just think about that. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're trying to get your business right, the way you get service is you do those things that lead to it, right? You do the job, you follow your contract, you communicate well, you be transparent. I fundamentally believe you create a virtuous cycle with your clients and your partners.
That's a great golden nugget. It's interesting. People always ask me, how did you grow so fast? And I say, I answered the phone and I did what I told people I was going to do. That was it. Like, that was literally how I grew so fast. And you talk about transparency. One other thing I could add to that is I admitted when I screwed up. Like, we're not perfect and I made mistakes, and I would just be like, yeah, I apologize. We screwed that up, but I'll make it right. People appreciate that. They know there are things that's going to happen when you're trying to cover it up. It's never healthy. So that transparency you're talking about, and the integrity of wanting to do a good job, trying to do a good job, but admitting if you make a mistake and just trying to do whatever you got to do to make it right, that really resonates with people. So I think that's a great golden nugget too.
Awesome.
Well, it was really great talking to you today. I mean, like I said, we could sit here for hours and talk shop. This is all fun stuff for me, but definitely appreciate your time. Appreciate you getting on here and talking about what's going on in the industry and your background. I'm excited to hear more about it in the future and how it unfolds and how you can bring your background to our industry. So thank you for being part of the podcast, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Sean. Appreciate what you do, and thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Elevator Entrepreneur Podcast. Until next time, stay safe out there, and I will continue to empower my fellow elevator entrepreneurs.